to one of the or contributing authors, Thakur Powdyel from Bhutan, who is a professor and educator by choice and was the Minister of Education in Bhutan between the years 2008 and 2013. And who is also the recipient of an honorary doctorate in innovation education in recognition of his outstanding contribution to global education thought. The background is that Bhutan decided to focus more on happiness than on GDP, which we heard a little bit about in the previous session, but now over to a central person for this, which is Mr. Powdyel. And so they invented the Gross National Happiness Index, which is now quite famous across the planet. But in order to explore how this could be manifested in education, Thakur Powdyel wrote the book, My Green School, which became the foundation under an educational reform in Bhutan, and also wrote the essay chapter in our book, titled The World That Might Have Been. Now, instead of me speaking more, I think, Mr. Powdyel, please bring us into your world and the world of how Bhutan takes on what a good life is. Over to you.
Thank you so much indeed. I would first like to acknowledge the very kind invitation extended to me by Dr. Anderson. And of course, the whole team has been working very hard on it. When I first looked at this, the name of the effort, what it means to be human, I had such a wonderful feeling. What it means to be human. It is very humbling. It brings us back to who we are as the human of the species. And I think this conversation that we're having ought to be an ongoing conversation all the time. It shouldn't end as an event, but an all-time conversation, because I think we began as humans, but over time, we might have become something else. That's why we need this reminder, these gentle alerts, to bring us back to who we are as the human of the species, as opposed to other species. We are supposed to be the Homo sapiens, thinking beings, able to make judgment, able to distinguish between right and wrong, good and bad, truth and falsehood, to differentiate us from the other members of living beings who also share this planet with us, the human of the species. Thank you so much indeed for starting this conversation, Dr. Anderson and all of you. And I'm so happy to be a little part of this big story. I work on the premise that every nation and every society ought to have its own North Star. Every nation ought to have its own North Star, just as indeed we, human beings, men, women, and children, ought to have our own dream. As you know, long ago, when we didn't have the precision equipment that we have today, sailors and mariners, lost on the wide open seas, looked at the North Star to find the direction towards the safety of the shore. Because the North Star was always there as a point of reference. And they set sail in the direction of that point of reference Today in the 21st century, we have smart equipment that can locate precise points on the sea, on the land, in the sky, and everywhere in between. And everybody is so busy that they may not even look at the North Star or feel the need to look at the North Star. But I believe that even today, in fact, more today than ever before, we need a North Star. We need our North Star to guide us in the direction that we want to go to. As societies, we need a North Star. Where will the society be 20 years down the line, 50 years down the line, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line? Where will my society be? Where will my country be 15 years from now, 20 years into the future? What North Star is going to guide my society, my country? What North Star is going to guide this world out of this chaos to something fulfilling and more meaningful and worthy of the human of the species? For Bhutan, the North Star was identified by our fourth king, His Majesty Jigme Singye Wangchuk, somewhere in the late 1970s. His Majesty was very young when he assumed that important responsibility of running the country. His father, the third king, His Majesty Jigme Dorje Wangchuk, passed away far away from home, and almost overnight, a young king, 16 going on 17, a young prince, 16 going on 17, had to assume that heavy responsibility of running the country. But even as he was a young prince in body, he was and has been a very wise and far-sighted, deeply reflective human being. He thought that Bhutan ought to follow a different North Star. As a young king trying to figure out how to take the country forward, he looked around the world to see as to how governments looked at progress. What did they mean by development? What was the goal of development? What is indeed the goal of life? Why do we make 5-year plans, annual plans? What do we call this development? What is the end goal? What does development do? What do we mean by it? What is progress? Is it only material progress? He looked around the world and found out that most governments, in fact, all governments around the world, used one unidimensional, highly utilitarian, and narrow yardstick called gross domestic product to measure development, to measure progress. In the opinion of the young king, gross domestic product as a measure of progress told only a part of the story. It didn't tell the whole story. And if you want a more reliable, a more holistic sense of development, you need to base that yardstick on a much broader set of variables. Because GDP is economics based, it is obsessed with economic efficiency. It is based on materials, goods and services, commodities, physical quantities. But life is more than that. Human life is more than materials. Life is so complex. It is so various, so subtle, so beautiful. We feel, we think, we reflect, we pray, we imagine, we marvel, we wonder at the world, and we marvel at at the mystery of the world, at the mystery of life. And all these capacities to dream, to wonder, to pray, to make friends, to live together in a harmonious way, together with everybody else in the society. All these human capacities make our life more worthwhile, more meaningful, and much more fulfilling. Of course, we need a basic economic security. But beyond that, life ought to aspire for something that's more fulfilling, more meaningful. So that is why His Majesty thought that GDP as a measure of human progress or societal progress was not adequate to give us a sense of who we are, this complex human being. We are not economic animals. We are a very precious human of the species. In our national language, Zanka, we call human beings Milu Rinpoche, the precious human being. Milu Rinpoche, the precious human being. And in Bildung, the way we look at human life and human beings is far more subtle, far more beautiful and complex than simply an aggregate of chemicals. For the young king, there had to be something more than a measure of economic prosperity to give us a sense of well-being and human flourishing, societal flourishing, national flourishing. How do we flourish as the human of the species? Not only as consumers. That's what GDP does. GDP is focused on a cycle of production and consumption, more production and more consumption, yet more production and yet more consumption. And imagine the world if our life cycle is based on this ongoing, relentless pursuit of having more, possessing more, owning more. This having mode is limited. We must also cultivate the being mode, the being mode. Who are we? That's why His Majesty thought that for Bhutan, there ought to be something more broad-based, and built on a far broader set of elements. And His Majesty gave the name to our North Star, gross national happiness. And for the last 45 years or so, this has been our North Star, gross national happiness. And His Majesty felt that gross national happiness is more important than gross domestic product. This has been our dream. We make our plans, our policies against these important gross national happiness principles. We monitor those and carry out research to see as to how our people are doing in different parts of the country on the scale of happiness. So for education, how does education respond to this big national vision? If a nation has a big dream, if a nation has its own North Star, the subsystems of the nation ought to be a part of that big dream. Because our young men and women, our boys and girls, the most precious segment of the population are in our schools, in our colleges and universities. And these young men and women ought to be able to share in the big vision of the country. That's why in 2009, the Ministry of Education launched a big nationwide educational reform initiative. We called it Educating for Gross National Happiness. It is a tall order. We have been educating for I don't know how many years, how many millennia. But over time, education itself, like GDP, has been reduced to mere acquisition of knowledge and information. What is knowledge after all? We can be very knowledgeable about some notorious things. But how do we use knowledge? How do we use information? Do we use it in the Faustian sense? Dr. Faustus, in Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, the play, he knows everything about the world. He has so much of knowledge. He has mastered all branches of knowledge, including necromancy. But he sacrificed the most precious element, the soul, to Mephistopheles. But there was something beautiful about Dr. Faustus. He had all science, all technology, all knowledge, but he also had this capacity for music. Today we have Faustian science, Faustian technology, Faustian knowledge, but no Faustian music. We have to bring back that Faustian music to our lives. Then perhaps we become more humans, or more humane. So education for me has always been an instrument of not only knowledge acquisition, but humanization. We have the most precious segment of the population in our schools, colleges, and universities. Our young men and women, boys and girls, our youth, they're going to build our futures. But if we limit their time in our seats of learning to simply acquiring information and knowledge in technology, and if they do not become human, able to work together, able to share this planet Earth with other beings, and have the humility to believe that we are just a small little microcosm of the big macrocosm of the universe, playing our little part, and making space for the flourishing of this beautiful planet. The sea and the land and the sky, the animals and the birds, the water that we drink, the air that we breathe. How do we treat them today? That's why in my green school, as Dr. Martin referred to earlier, my green school, when we launched this program called Educating for Gross National Happiness, it's very broad and very general. So we needed a strategy. And the strategy that we identified was building green schools as a means to an end. And the end was supposed to be, and still continues to be, Green Bhutan. So green schools for Green Bhutan. But over time, I realized that we all want education to be valuable, to be powerful, to be purposeful. How do we make education purposeful? How do we educate our young men and women? We build schools, colleges, and universities across the world like nobody's business. Why do we do that? There ought to be a big purpose for setting up a school, a big purpose to set up a college or a university, a big purpose to collect all these young men and women and put them in our schools, colleges, and universities for extended periods of time. 15 years, 20 years there. What are they doing? See? Are they simply acquiring knowledge like Dr. Faustus did? Or are they also becoming more humans and more humane? That's why for me, my green school has 8 elements, 8 elements. These 8 elements are like the 8 levels of consciousness. And my first element in my green school is ecological greenery or natural greenery. Young men and women ought to be able to understand where we are in relation to the earth. Every morning we get up, we set our feet, we place our feet on the surface of Mother Earth without ever asking whether we have permission to put our feet on Mother Earth's bodies. We have been breathing this air. We have taken it for granted without ever asking anybody, can we breathe it? Drinking our water without ever asking anybody, can we drink it? Where does it come from? Who gives it? If the earth says, don't walk on me, if the water says, don't drink me, if the air says, don't breathe me, where do the human of the species stand? That's why our young people ought to be able to understand and appreciate this relationship, fundamental relationship between us, the human of the species, and our planet Earth. How do I relate myself to the air that I breathe, the water that I drink, the vegetation that gives me oxygen, the plants, the animals, the birds, the rock, the soil, the water, the springs, the streams, the rivers. How am I related? I think our young people, to be more humane, or to be more human, or to be able to open their senses, the eyes that see, sometimes we use them to unsee. The eyes that see, we use them to unsee. We have to make them see beyond the surface. The ears that hear, we often use them to unhear. We close them to the stimuli that come to us from Mother Nature. The heart that feels, sometimes we use it to unfeel. The mind that thinks, often we use it to unthink or not think at all. To be human, I think, we have to see more, hear more, above all, feel more. What do we do in our schools with our children, in our colleges and universities? Are we too busy to cover the syllabus? Send the children off to the next grade? Or do we have time to reflect on these fundamental relationships? Today we're talking about global warming, climate change. We are panicking. In the next few years, where are we going to be? That's why it's important for young people to take care of the earth, the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, to take care of life. Life in all its multiple forms. By the way, my green school, the title is My Green School, but it is not only about schools or education. My green school is about life, and life in its multiple varieties. Human life, animal life, bird life, plant life, life in the sea, on land, in the sky, everywhere in between, life. So anything that supports and sustains life in its infinite variety is green. So we can have a green school, we can have a green college or a university, we can have a green home, green economy, green parliament, green diplomacy, green business, green industry, green minds, green hearts. Anything that supports life to flourish, to bloom, and to blossom, that is green. So when our children come to school, I feel that education must have a much, much bigger mindful vision for them. Otherwise, it's very unfair. If we keep telling the children, life is hard, it's difficult, it's very competitive, you have to work very hard to compete with everybody else, to get ahead of everybody else. If life is to be a competition all the time, we have no time to stand and stare, as William Wordsworth would say. It becomes a fight all the time. That's why in my green school, young men and women ought to be able to appreciate this mutual relationship between us, the human of the species, and planet Earth. Then when they become leaders themselves, they'll make good policies to protect our planet, to protect our Earth, to protect the sanctity of air, the sanctity of water, the sanctity of the soil, the sanctity of Mother Earth, the integrity of these life-giving gifts of Mother Nature. See? I think it'll take a long time for me to talk about all the other elements, but certainly I just mentioned the name. So the first circle, it comes as my green school comes with 8 levels of consciousness. It comes in the form of a mandala. I call it Sherik mandala. Sherik in my language is deep learning. It's education, deep learning. So the first level is ecological, natural element. The second circle is the social element. The third level is the cultural greenery, intellectual greenery. Then only comes academic greenery at the fourth level. Then is aesthetic greenery, the ability to appreciate good, beautiful, tasteful things. The next one is spiritual greenery. I have to explain what I mean by spiritual greenery. Spirituality has got nothing to do with religion or religiosity. Spirituality liberates people. Religion or religiosity regiments or limits people's sensibilities. So spiritual greenery is about appreciating the fact that as we are not full. As we are not complete. As we are not perfect. But in relation to something fuller, more perfect, more complete, we also become that much fuller. Just as a flower kept by the windowsill looks towards the sun to achieve its fullness, so also we human beings need some models, some big ideas, some noble ideas to look towards, so that by that much we also become fuller and more realized and more complete. And the eighth element of the level of consciousness is ethical consciousness or moral consciousness. Today, all around the world, we see instances of corruption in high offices. Big organizations collapse overnight because people over there are not able to make a distinction between right and wrong, good and bad, truth and falsehood. This ability to make distinctions between these categories of values, right as opposed to something called wrong, good as opposed to something called bad or evil, and truth as opposed to something called untruth or falsehood. This ability to make these very fine distinctions amongst categories of values makes fine leaders. A leader who does not bother about values, who doesn't bother about being mindful or thoughtful, will be a liability to the organization, to the nation, to the societies, to institutions. That's why we feel that to be more human, I believe education ought to be able to sensitize, not only sensitize, but instill and bring out from deep within themselves these abilities, these gifts, to be more ecologically and naturally conscious and respectful, to be socially more sensitive. As I'm only one, but I live together with everybody else. So The second element is social greenery, is it? But I'm also a product of culture, see. Culture. I belong to a whole, a bigger entity called culture. How do I relate to the culture of my country, see? Or of humanity, see? What do I do my mind for? What do I use my mind for? Do I use it for appreciating and generating ideas? The mind is the home of ideas. See? What do I use it for? Young people ought to be able to think of that. See? Academic subjects, physics, chemistry, biology, languages, culture, literature. These subjects are loaded with the power. How do I use the power of literature, the power of history, the power of mathematics to bring about a change, to transform the society, to transform nations? Aesthetics, the role of aesthetics in our lives. How do aesthetics broaden the range of our lives? If we're able to make these aesthetic sense in young children, perhaps they'll be able to stay away more often from the mobile phones, from the internet. They'll be more creative. Instead of looking at somebody else's creations, they'll be more creative, more imaginative. They'll be able to produce themselves objects of art. So aesthetic sense will be developed, enriched. So they're able to develop integrity, able to develop the sense of who they are. They become more fully realizing. So I talked about, I think I touched upon all these 8 elements in very brief, but for me, these 8 elements make a complete school, a complete education system, a complete educational programs. And if we're able to put our young men and women together through these educational experiences, when they graduate from our schools, colleges, and universities and join the larger society, my hope is that they will be able to release these positive energies to the larger society and make our societies and our nations and the world a better place, a more humane place, and they themselves will be more human. Thank you so much. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.